My name is John Todd, and I am, by most accounts, a perfectly reasonable person. I pay my rent on time. I return library books before the due date. I hold doors open for strangers and say thank you to baristas even when they spell my name wrong, which is every single time, without exception. I am, in the truest sense of the word, agreeable. That was the problem. Being agreeable had gotten me into situations I never wanted to be in. It got me volunteering for overtime shifts I didn't need. It got me agreeing to be a groomsman at a wedding for a guy I barely remembered from college. And now, most catastrophically of all, it had gotten me living next door to Marvin Case. Not that living next door to Marvin was inherently catastrophic. On paper, Marvin Case was a fine neighbor. He was quiet. He didn't throw parties. His cooking smelled incredible at 7 in the morning, which was more of a blessing than a curse. He knocked before borrowing things, and he always returned them. The problem wasn't what Marvin did. The problem was what Marvin made me feel, and feelings, in my experience, were nothing but trouble. It started 8 months ago, when I moved into apartment 4B of the Linden Heights complex on the corner of Marsh and 7th. I had 3 boxes of books, 2 suitcases of clothes, and one very clear goal: keep my head down, do my job, and under no circumstances get attached to anyone or anything in this building. I lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, I locked myself out of my apartment at 11 at night, wearing nothing but an oversized sleep shirt and a pair of socks with little clouds on them. I stood in the hallway, staring at my own door like it had personally betrayed me, and tried to remember if I'd given the spare key to the building manager or left it at my sister's place 2 cities away. The answer, as it turned out, was neither. I had left it on my kitchen counter. "You look like you're trying to intimidate it into opening," said a voice behind me. I turned around. Marvin Case was leaning against the doorframe of apartment 4A, arms crossed, wearing a gray Henley and sweatpants. With the kind of easy, unhurried smile that made it seem like he stumbled across stranded neighbors in hallways all the time and found it genuinely entertaining, he was, objectively, the most attractive person I had ever seen in real life. Not in an overwhelming, theatrical way. More in the way that a very well-composed photograph is attractive, everything in exactly the right place, nothing overdone. Dark eyes with a warmth in them that felt like it meant something. A jaw that could have been designed specifically to make people feel things they weren't prepared for. And that smile. That easy, unhurried, completely unfair smile. "The door," he clarified, nodding at my apartment. "You're staring it down." "I locked myself out," I said, "I gathered." He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward me, and I became suddenly, acutely aware of my cloud socks. "I'm Marvin." 4A, John. 4B, I know. "I saw you moving in on Tuesday." He looked at the door, then back at me. "Do you have the building manager's number?" "It's on my phone." "Which is inside?" He nodded slowly, like he was working through a very complicated equation. Then he said, "You can wait it out at mine if you want." "I'll make tea," and I, being agreeable, said yes. That was my first mistake. His apartment was warm in a way that felt deliberate. Not cluttered, but lived in, books stacked on every available surface. A record player in the corner that was actually playing something soft and instrumental, a coffee table with a half-finished crossword and 3 different pens laid out like he'd been trying each one and hadn't found a favorite yet. It smelled like whatever he'd been cooking, something with garlic and herbs, and underneath that, something that was just him. Warm. Clean. Quietly devastating. He made tea. He sat across from me at a small kitchen table that had a chip in one corner and a ring stain that someone had tried to sand away but not quite succeeded. He asked me where I'd moved from, and I told him. He asked what I did, and I told him that too. He told me he worked in urban planning. That he'd been in 4A for 2 years, that he'd chosen this building specifically because the windows faced east and he liked morning light. We talked for 2 hours. At 1 in the morning, the building manager answered a call from Marvin's phone and promised to bring the spare key up within the hour. While we waited, Marvin refilled my tea without asking, and I sat in his warm apartment listening to his record player and thinking, very clearly and very calmly, I am in serious trouble, because I knew, with the same certainty I knew my own name, that if I let myself, I could fall completely and irreparably for this man, and I could not do that. Let me explain something about my history with feelings. Specifically, feelings for people who were kind to me. I fall fast. I always have. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's honest. Someone does one genuinely kind thing, makes me tea, remembers how I take my coffee, asks a follow-up question about something I mentioned 3 weeks ago, and something in my chest goes very still and very warm and then immediately starts constructing entire futures that I have no right to be constructing. The falling isn't the problem. The landing is. The last time I fell like that, his name was Derek, and he was my coworker for 2 years, and he was kind in exactly the same effortless way Marvin was kind. He made tea. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. And I had built an entire cathedral of feeling around him before I understood that his kindness was constitutional, not directed. He was kind to everyone. I was not special. I was just another person in his orbit who had mistaken warmth for intention, that had taken me a very long time to recover from. Longer than I'd admit to anyone who asked, so I knew the signs. I recognized the architecture of what was starting to form in my chest, and I knew, with grim clarity, that the only way to protect myself was to stop it before it started. To keep Marvin Case at a firm, comfortable distance, to not become someone who lived for the sound of 4A's door opening in the morning. I had 1 month to figure out how to accomplish that. I did not figure it out. Instead, I did the following. I helped him carry groceries twice, once because he knocked and asked and I was agreeable, and once because I saw him struggling in the lobby and my hands were already moving before my brain had a chance to object. I lent him a book he mentioned he'd been meaning to read, and then spent 3 days quietly thrilled every time I imagined him reading it. I learned that he was allergic to walnuts and couldn't whistle and had grown up in a house with a very large garden that he missed very much. I learned that he laughed with his whole face, that he got genuinely, adorably annoyed when people misused the word literally. And that he always knocked 3 times, 2 quick and 1 slow, like a signature. I was not keeping him at a distance. I was memorizing him, and then, one evening in November, my neighbor across the hall, a forthright woman named Clara who was either a life coach or a personal trainer and possibly both, knocked on my door, looked at my face for approximately 4 seconds, and said, "Oh honey, you've got it bad." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, "the guy in 4A. She said it like it was obvious. Like I had been walking around with it written on my forehead. "We're neighbors," I said. "We're friendly. You smiled when his door opened this morning," she said. I saw it. You thought the hallway was empty. I closed my door on her. Gently. Politely. Because I was agreeable. Then I stood in my kitchen and stared at my hands and thought, this is bad. This is exactly the Derek situation, and I am walking into it with my eyes open, and I need to stop. The problem was that I didn't know how to create distance without being rude. I wasn't built for coldness. Every time I tried to be even slightly short with Marvin, something in me revolted. It felt wrong in the same physical way that reaching for something on a high shelf wrong, an unnatural stretch that the body objects to. But what if, and this was the idea that came to me at 2 in the morning. While I was lying on my back staring at the ceiling, what if I didn't have to be cold? What if I could just be someone slightly different? Someone who was not exactly rude, but who was difficult. Prickly. The kind of person who was interesting to observe from a distance but too exhausting to actually pursue. What if I invented a version of myself that would naturally, organically, push Marvin away? Looking back, I cannot overstate how stupid this plan was. At the time, it seemed elegant. I gave it 3 days of thought. I needed to be specific, because vague prickliness was easy to dismiss. I needed a character that was coherent and consistent, one that would be believable enough to sustain, but off-putting enough to achieve the desired effect. Here is what I came up with. The character I decided to play was an Omega who knew his own worth. Not in a quiet, dignified way. In a loud, slightly exhausting, borderline theatrical way. The kind of person who made comments about the quality of things in an offhand tone that suggested they had simply higher standards than everyone else. The kind of person who deflected vulnerability with condescension. Who was beautiful and knew it, useful and knew it, and had decided that this knowledge gave them the right to be somewhat insufferable about it. I will be honest, I don't think of myself as particularly beautiful. I am average to acceptable on my best days. But character work requires commitment, and if I was going to play someone insufferable, I had to play them from the inside out. So I made a decision, standing in front of my bathroom mirror on a Tuesday morning, that for the foreseeable future, I was going to carry myself like someone who had been told they were remarkable so many times they had grown tired of hearing it. I practiced the look. It was somewhere between boredom and mild disdain, with a lifted chin and a very slight narrowing of the eyes. I practiced the voice, not meaner, exactly, but drier. More clipped. The kind of voice that implied you had better places to be and were tolerating the current conversation as a kindness. I named this character, internally, Difficult John. Regular John was the one who smiled at the sound of a neighbor's door. Difficult John did not smile. Difficult John had opinions about the quality of building hallway lighting and was not shy about sharing them. I was ready. The first test came on a Wednesday evening, when Marvin knocked, 2 quick, 1 slow, and asked if I had a spare pen. He was holding what appeared to be a half-finished crossword. His own crossword, I noticed, from his kitchen table. Regular John would have said, "Of course, come in." "Do you want tea?" Difficult John said. "What happened to the 3 pens I saw on your table last week?" Marvin blinked. Then, slowly, a smile started at the corner of his mouth. "One ran out, one I can't find, one I'm pretty sure the crossword ate. Crosswords don't eat pens, this one does." "It's particularly aggressive." I stared at him for a long moment, which was not part of any practiced look, because the practiced look was boredom and this was something closer to helpless fondness trying very hard to disguise itself. Then I went to my desk, got a pen, and held it out without saying anything. He took it. His fingers brushed mine, which I refused to acknowledge. "Thank you, John," he said, in the tone of someone who found me charming. "This was not the intended effect. Bring it back before 10, I said, and closed the door. I stood in my hallway and breathed. Then I thought, okay. Difficult John is going to need some refining. The second test came the following Saturday, when we both ended up in the building's small laundry room at the same time. This was a situation Regular John would have treated as an opportunity. Difficult John was going to treat it as an inconvenience. "There are only 2 machines, I announced, walking in and looking at the space with the expression of someone doing a structural assessment and finding it wanting. "There are." Marvin agreed, unloading his laundry basket. "This building has 12 units, 14, actually, which makes 2 machines inadequate." He looked at me. Not irritated, which was the goal, but curious. "Did something happen with the machines?" "Nothing happened. I'm simply observing that the ratio of machines to residents is insufficient." He nodded slowly. "Have you been thinking about that for a while?" "I notice things," I said, and loaded my laundry with the air of someone who had simply higher standards for laundry room infrastructure. There was a pause. Then Marvin said, conversationally, "You know, you're interesting. I'm sure many people are interesting, not the same kind of interesting as you." I glanced at him. He was leaning against his machine with his arms crossed and that warm, unhurried look on his face that was becoming the centerpiece of my problem. He didn't look put off. He looked engaged. Like Difficult John was a puzzle he had just decided was worth his time. This was also not the intended effect. "My interesting is not for general consumption," I said, which was possibly the most unhinged thing I had ever said out loud, and I said it in the dry, clipped Difficult John voice, and Marvin's smile widened by approximately 10%. "Good thing I'm not the general public," he said. I took my laundry cart and went to the machine farthest from him, which still was not very far. Because the room was approximately the size of a large closet, I did not look at him for the rest of the time we were in there. This took considerable effort. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. The problem with playing a character consistently is that the longer you play it, the harder it is to remember where the character ends and you begin. This is a thing they tell you in acting classes, I imagine, for exactly this reason. By week 3 of the Difficult John experiment, something unexpected had happened. I had not pushed Marvin away. In fact, Marvin seemed more interested in me than ever. He knocked on my door more often. He lingered in conversations instead of letting them conclude naturally. He started finding reasons to be in the same spaces as me, the lobby, the mailroom, the hallway outside our respective apartments, and when I gave him difficult John, he gave me this look. This warm, thoughtful, slightly amused look that was starting to live in my chest rent-free, and here was the other unexpected thing, difficult John was starting to feel comfortable, not comfortable the way a second skin feels, not yet. But something had shifted. The lifted chin, the dry voice, the practiced look of mild disdain, they had started to come naturally. Not because I was a different person, but because some part of difficult John was. Apparently, an actual part of me that I had simply never given permission to exist before. This should have alarmed me more than it did. One evening, Marvin knocked at 7 with a container of whatever he'd made for dinner, something with rice and vegetables that smelled extraordinary, and said he'd made too much and I should have some. Regular John would have said thank you and meant it softly and added this to the running list of things Marvin had done that were quietly ruining him. Difficult John took the container, looked at it with the expression of someone conducting a preliminary inspection, and said, "Is this basmati or long grain?" Marvin stared at me. Then he laughed, not a polite laugh. A genuine one, the whole face kind. "Basmati, good." I looked up. Long grain has a different texture, I know, most people don't notice, I'm not most people. I looked at him for a long moment. He was smiling, and his hair was slightly disheveled in the way it got when he'd been working at his desk, and there was a smear of something on his forearm that was probably cooking related, and I was standing in my doorway holding a container of his cooking thinking thoughts that difficult John had absolutely no framework for. "Thank you for the food," I said, and closed the door. I sat on my kitchen floor and ate his cooking and it was, as expected, remarkable. Later that night, I sent him a text. Our texts had started about a month ago, gradually, the way these things do. I had told myself they were neighborly. Logistical. Difficult John communicated by text with the same slightly lofty efficiency as in person. I sent, "The rice was good," he replied, almost immediately. "High praise from you," I replied. "Don't read into it," he replied, "too late." I've already had it framed. I stared at this reply for a full minute. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen floor and resumed eating his food and thought, with great clarity, I am not succeeding at this plan. There was an incident at the end of week 4 that I think about often. We were both in the lobby. And there was a man from the 3rd floor, a recent arrival, broad-shouldered, openly friendly, who had apparently decided that the best way to introduce himself was to compliment Marvin and me simultaneously, with the specific energy of someone who was interested in Marvin and was performing friendliness toward me as a social formality. His name was Stephen something. He had the kind of confidence that came from being told yes frequently and not knowing what to do with no. He was very friendly to Marvin. He was also, in the course of being friendly to Marvin, mildly dismissive of me in the small, seamless ways that people are dismissive when they're being competitive and trying to seem like they're not. A half-second delay before acknowledging something I said. A comment turned slightly back toward Marvin before I'd finished making it. Regular John would have stepped back. Would have found something else to look at, some graceful way to make himself smaller so the social geometry worked out more smoothly for everyone. Difficult John said, in a completely calm and even voice, "You did that thing where you redirect mid-sentence before I've finished. It's a habit worth breaking." Stephen blinked. Marvin went very still beside me. "Sorry." Stephen said, "Redirecting," I said. "Before the speaker is done. It signals you're not actually listening, just waiting for your turn. Which is fine. But it's noticeable." I smiled pleasantly. "Just something to be aware of." Stephen looked at me like I had grown an extra limb. Marvin looked at me like I had done something that genuinely surprised him. Not negatively. Something else. Something I couldn't immediately categorize. Stephen excused himself not long after. We stood in the lobby, and I smoothed my jacket in a way difficult John would, and I said, neutrally, "I'm going up, John." Marvin said. Something in his voice stopped me. I turned. He was looking at me with that expression, the warm, thoughtful, slightly more than curious one, and he said, "That was." He paused. "You didn't have to do that, I know." I said. "I did it anyway." I went upstairs before he could say anything else. In my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed and replayed his face and the way he'd said my name, and I thought, this plan has gone wrong in every conceivable direction, and I am not even certain I want to correct it anymore. The conversation happened on a Friday evening in the building's small rooftop space, which had 2 plastic chairs, a dead plant that nobody had removed, and a view of the city that was either beautiful or bleak depending on your mood and the light. I had gone up with a book and the intention of reading it. Marvin had apparently had the same idea, because he came through the door 10 minutes later with his own book, saw me, and said, "Oh," in a tone that contained several things at once. "You can stay," I said, in the difficult John voice, which at this point was so second nature that I didn't even register doing it. "I won't be up here long." "You say that," he said, sitting in the other chair, "and then you stay for 2 hours. I've noticed." I looked at him over my book. "You've been tracking my roof habits." "I've been noticing things," he said, returning my own words from the laundry room, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing. We read in something that was not quite silence because the city was never quiet, and I turned pages without reading them, and after about 20 minutes Marvin closed his book on his finger to keep his place and said, conversationally, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to regardless," I said. "True." He looked at me. "When you moved in, you were different." I kept my eyes on my page. "People change, in 8 months, some people change faster than others." He was quiet for a moment. "The city did its city things below us, and the sky was the specific shade of orange-purple it gets in early winter evenings, and I was acutely aware of how close the 2 plastic chairs were. The first night," he said, "when you were locked out. You were," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "You were open. Warm. You talked about your life like you were genuinely inviting me into it." I said nothing, and then, a few weeks later, something shifted. "You got, not cold. That's not the right word. More like, you started carrying yourself differently. Like you had decided to take up more space." I turned a page I hadn't read. "I want you to know," Marvin said, "that I noticed both versions." I looked up. He was watching me with that expression, the one I'd been cataloging for months without letting myself name it. "The first version of you was lovely," he said. I liked him. "But the second version," he stopped. Seemed to make a decision. "The second version is the one I find myself thinking about." Everything in my chest went very quiet. "Why?" I said, and my voice came out stripped of the difficult John tone for the first time in weeks. Which was involuntary and alarming, because, he said, "the first version of you was agreeable. And agreeable is nice. But the second version says what he actually means. Stands in a lobby and tells a man he's not actually listening. Has opinions about basmati rice. Comes up to the roof with a book and stays for 2 hours even when he says he won't." He paused. "That version seems more like the truth of you." I stared at him. The plan, the whole beautiful, idiotic plan, was collapsing in real time, and I was not doing anything to stop it. "Marvin," I said, "you don't have to explain anything," he said, quickly, like he'd anticipated a deflection. "I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to know." He opened his book again. "I like this version of you. The one you've been since November." He read his book. I sat in my chair and did not read mine. "After a while," I said, "the first version was more agreeable because he was afraid." Marvin looked up. "Of getting attached," I said, in a voice that was completely mine and no one else's. "To things that weren't going to stay." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "And the second version?" "The second version," I said, apparently decided that if something was going to hurt, it might as well hurt after being honest. He set his book down on his knee. "Is that what this is going to be? Something that hurts?" I looked at him, at the warm, unhurried, completely unfair face of him, and I said, "I genuinely don't know." "That's fair," he said. We sat on the roof until it was fully dark, and the city lit up below us in all its complicated, overcrowded, beautiful way, and when the temperature dropped enough that my jacket wasn't sufficient, Marvin stood up and said, "Come on. I'll make something warm," and I went. His apartment, at 9 on a Friday evening, was exactly as warm as it had been the first night. The record player was going again, something I'd heard enough times now that I knew the album. There were books everywhere. The crossword from last week was still on the table. Which meant he either hadn't finished it or hadn't cleared it away, and I suspected the latter because Marvin, for all his neatness, was sentimentally untidy. He put the kettle on and I stood in his kitchen doorway and said, "I have to tell you something." "Okay," he said, without turning from the stove. "The second version of me," I said. "It wasn't real." He looked over his shoulder. "I mean, parts of it were real," I amended. "More real than I expected." "But it was, I invented it. Intentionally. As a strategy." He turned fully to face me. "A strategy for what?" "Pushing you away," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "That's the reason," I said. "For the change in November." I realized I was getting attached, and I didn't want to get attached, because in my experience getting attached to people who are kind to me leads to a very specific kind of damage that takes a long time to recover from. So I decided to be someone who was difficult enough that you'd lose interest. Marvin was quiet. "It didn't work," I said. "Which you probably gathered." "I gathered," he said, "and I'm telling you now because you said you liked that version, and I don't want you to like a version that was built as a deterrent. It seems unfair." I looked at the floor. "The opinions about basmati rice are real, for the record. Those are actually mine." He made a sound that was. I was fairly sure, a suppressed laugh. I said, have actually been up to that roof on at least 6 occasions and stayed for more than an hour each time. That's just a thing I do." "The claiming I was leaving was difficult, John," he repeated. "That's what I called the character." Internally, he was definitely laughing now, quietly, in a way that wasn't unkind. "You named him." It made him easier to maintain. He crossed the kitchen, and I took a half step back that I immediately regretted because it put me against the doorframe, and he stopped a reasonable distance away and looked at me with the expression I had spent months cataloging. "John," he said. "Yes, the version of you that was invented to push me away," he said, "somehow revealed the parts of you that I find the most genuinely compelling. The directness. The opinions. The way you stood in that lobby and said, calmly, exactly what you thought." He paused. "Do you understand why that might be interesting to me?" "Because you're a deeply unusual person," I said. "Because," he said, "most people who are afraid make themselves smaller. You made yourself bigger." He tilted his head slightly. "That's not a deterrent. John, that's one of the most interesting things I've ever seen someone do." I looked at him. The kettle started making noise behind him and neither of us moved. "I still don't know," I said, "if this is going to be something that hurts." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide that tonight, but you're asking me something." "I'm asking," he said carefully, "if you'd be willing to find out." The record player turned something slow and quiet in the other room. The kettle was boiling. The city was doing its city things outside the east-facing windows that he'd chosen this apartment specifically for. I said, "I'm willing to find out. We didn't kiss that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important for the record. What we did was sit at his kitchen table with tea and his aggressive crossword and talk for 3 hours. The way we had the first night, but different. The first night I'd been careful. Measuring everything I said against what it might reveal. This time I wasn't careful. I told him about Derek. Not all of it, but enough. The 2 years, the mistaking warmth for intention, the very long recovery. He listened with the complete, unhurried attention that I now understood was simply how Marvin listened to things. He told me things too. He'd had his own version of that, someone he'd given years to who treated his steadiness like a given, like something that didn't need to be acknowledged or returned. Someone who mistook his patience for inexhaustibility, I think, he said, tracing the edge of his mug. That people who are genuinely kind sometimes attract people who are looking for someone to be kind to them, specifically. Not mutually. Just directionally. You're describing me, I said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you're describing yourself. I'm not sure I know you well enough yet to say, and you'd like to. He looked up. Yes. The crossword sat between us on the table. I looked at it, at his 3 pens lined up beside it, and on impulse I picked one up and filled in an answer I could see from where I was sitting, 7 letters, a word meaning to make something more complex than necessary. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. You could see that from there, he said. I've been looking at that crossword every time I'm in this kitchen, I said. I've had time to think about it. He smiled, the whole face won. I put the pen down. The pen works, by the way. The one you thought was dead, of course it does, he said. The following week was a specific kind of strange that I don't think there are precise words for. Nothing had changed in the technical sense. We were still neighbors, still John and Marvin, still on either side of the wall between 4A and 4B. But the air between us had shifted in some fundamental way, the way a room changes when you've moved the furniture back to where it belongs. He knocked twice on Monday to show me something funny he'd seen on his way to work. On Wednesday I left a note on his door with the answer to another crossword clue I'd been thinking about, which was absurd, and he texted me at noon that day. I want you to know that was unhinged behavior and I loved it. On Thursday, we were both in the lobby when the package delivery person arrived with a box for me that was too large for the mailroom. Marvin held the elevator without being asked. When we got to our floor and I struggled to get the key in the lock one-handed, he took the box without ceremony and held it while I opened my door, and when I said thank you he just nodded and handed it back, and the entire exchange was so easy it almost hurt. Almost. I was learning, slowly, the difference between the ease that precedes damage and the ease that comes from something being genuinely good. They felt similar from the inside. But there were signs, if you knew how to look. Derek's ease had always had a slight quality of performance to it, a friendliness that had just enough awareness of its own warmth. Marvin's ease was different. It didn't know it was warm. It was just warm. Friday evening, he knocked at 7 with no particular reason. Did you need something? I asked, in a voice that was completely mine. No, he said. I opened the door wider. He came in. I made tea. We sat on my floor, which was unusual because I didn't have quite enough seating for 2 people and the couch was buried under laundry I'd been meaning to sort, and I was dimly aware that regular John would have been mortified by the laundry and difficult John would have made a comment about it, and whoever I was now just sat cross-legged on the floor with my tea and didn't think about it too hard. Can I ask you something? Marvin said. You will regardless, I said, returning the thing from the roof. He smiled. Fair. He looked at his mug. When you built Difficult John, when you were playing that character, was any part of it fun? I thought about it honestly. The lobby moment, I said, the Stephen thing, yes. I considered. I don't usually say the thing I'm actually thinking. I was saying the thing I was actually thinking and it was, yes. That was satisfying, and the rice thing, basmati does have a better texture. I agree completely, he said. You made long grain the week before, I pointed out. I know. I ran out of basmati. I made peace with the compromise. I respect that, I said. Which sounded absurd but wasn't. He laughed. I looked at him laughing and thought, clearly and with full awareness, I am completely gone on this person. There is nothing left of the original plan. It has been entirely consumed, I think, Marvin said, when his laugh settled. That Difficult John was a character you built as a shield, but the material you used to build him was real. You can't make something out of nothing. That's what worries me, I said. He looked at me. Because Difficult John was supposed to be a deterrent, I said. He was supposed to be too much. Too prickly, too opinionated, too present. And instead I found him, Marvin said, quietly, the most interesting person in the building. Which means, I said, that either your judgment is questionable, or, he said, that the version of you that takes up space and says what you mean and holds your ground in a lobby is not too much. He paused. It's actually exactly enough. I stared at my tea. John, he said. I looked up. He was close enough that the distance felt intentional, maintained, not accidental. Like he was waiting for something. Like a question was hanging in the air between us, one that had been hanging there since the roof, and the answer was mine to give. I said, I'm still afraid. I know, he said, that doesn't go away just because I want it to. I know that too, and I stopped. Reorganized. I'm not good at this. At asking for things. Or saying when I need something. I default to fine. I've been defaulting to fine for years. You built an entire alternate personality rather than tell me you liked me, he said, gently. I'm aware. I looked at him. Helpless fondness, entirely unguarded. That's a fair characterization. I'm not asking you to be someone who doesn't need reassurance, he said. I'm asking you to be someone who tells me when you need it. He tilted his head slightly. That seems like something Difficult John would actually be capable of. Difficult John, I said, is apparently a more functional version of me in several ways, or, Marvin said. You're more than you've been letting yourself be. And you found it by accident while trying to protect yourself. Which is, honestly, one of the most human things I've ever heard. I was quiet, then I said, you made tea that first night. He blinked at the shift, and you put a record on, I said. And you asked about my life like you genuinely wanted to know. And something in me understood, even then, how dangerous that was. How quickly I could fall for that kind of, I looked for the word. That kind of uncalculated kindness, uncalculated, he repeated. You don't think about being warm, I said. It just is. And for someone who's been burned by mistaking warmth for intention, I stopped. John, he said, and his voice was quiet and certain, it's intention. I looked at him. In case that's the thing you needed to hear, he said. It's not constitutional. It's not how I am with everyone. You are not Derek, and I am not whoever Derek was. His voice was steady without being loud, the way he was about most things. I knocked on your door the first time because I live across the hall and it seemed like the right thing. But I kept knocking, he said, because of you. The record player would have been a nice touch, but I wasn't in his apartment. I was in mine, and mine was quiet except for the city outside and the faint sound of the building settling. I said, okay. He waited, okay, I said again, differently, and I kissed him, which was regular John and Difficult John and whoever I was in between, all at once, and it was easy in the right way, the way that comes from something being genuinely good. The weeks after that are harder to narrate, not because they were complicated but because they were simple in a way that resists being made into a story. There were mornings. There were evenings. There was tea and crosswords and the record player and the view from the roof, and there was the gradual, almost geological process of learning another person's rhythms and letting them learn yours. I am not naturally good at being known. This is something I had to learn to do. Slowly, in the way you learn any skill that doesn't come intuitively, by doing it badly first and doing it better over time. Marvin was patient. Not in a saintly, exhausting way. In the way of someone who had decided the project was worth the timeline. I told him things. Not all at once, not in big revelatory moments, but in the small accumulations that are how real intimacy actually works. The thing I mentioned over dinner, the detail I admitted on the roof, the night I said something difficult and then waited, tensed, for it to be used against me, and it wasn't. He told me things too. The job that had consumed 3 years and left him emptier than when he'd started. The friendship that had frayed in ways that still sat with him. The house with the garden he missed, and specifically one tree that had been there since before he was born, and the particular grief of missing a place that still exists but that you can no longer access. I understood grief of that specific shape. Missing things that weren't gone but were out of reach. Do you want to go back? I asked him once, about the house with the garden. He thought about it. I want to grow something, he said eventually. Somewhere. Someday. I think that's what I actually miss, the feeling that things were growing around me. I thought about this for a long time afterward. One morning in February, I bought a small plant from the market downstairs. Nothing elaborate. One of those low-maintenance ones that the card said thrived on neglect, which seemed appropriate given my track record. I put it on my windowsill and texted Marvin a photo of it. He replied, "Is that what I think it is?" I replied, "It's a plant." He replied, "You bought a plant." I replied, "I've been known to make purchases." He replied, "I'm coming over in 5 minutes." He came over in 5 minutes. looked at the plant on my windowsill, looked at me, and did the whole face smile. "Don't make a thing of it," I said. "Too late," he said. "I've already had it framed." I looked at him. "I said that to you once," he reminded me. "I remember," I said, "in the context of high praise from you." He said, "I'm aware." He was still smiling. I was trying not to. The plant sat on my windowsill in the February morning light, which was thin and bright and exactly the kind Marvin had chosen his apartment for, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I was so afraid of. This ease. This warmth. This person in my kitchen, in my morning, in my life. I had spent months building a character to push this exact moment away. I had built him out of material that turned out to be real, and the real material had attracted exactly what I was trying to avoid, and here we were. "Marvin," I said. He looked at me. "I'm glad the plan failed," I said. He crossed the kitchen, unhurried, and kissed me on the forehead. Which should not have been as devastating as it was, and then he made tea because that's what he did and I let him because that's what I did, and we stood in my kitchen in February with a plant on the windowsill and the city outside and the life I'd been so afraid of settling around us, quiet and good. There are things I understand now that I didn't understand a year ago. The first is this: agreeable is not the same as honest. I spent years being agreeable and calling it kindness when actually it was avoidance, the avoidance of conflict, of need, of anything that might expose the seams of me. Difficult John, for all his invented origins, was more honest than regular John, because he said the things he actually thought. And honesty, it turns out, is not the same as arrogance, though they can wear similar clothes. The second is this: the person you pretend to be, when you're pretending carefully enough, is sometimes the person you actually are but have been afraid to be. I made difficult John out of the parts of me I had decided were too much. Too opinionated. Too willing to hold ground. Too present. And what I found, when I gave those parts oxygen and room, was that they weren't too much at all. They were just me. The third is this: Marvin Case was right about one thing in particular. Becoming larger when afraid, instead of smaller, that is a strange thing to do. It is not a natural thing. I am still not entirely sure why I did it. But I think some part of me understood that making myself smaller had never actually kept me safe. It had kept me invisible. And invisible is a different kind of danger. The fourth, and last, is this: Marvin Case knocked on my door the first time because I was his neighbor. He kept knocking because of me. I know this now with the certainty that comes from watching someone choose you repeatedly, in small ways and large ones, over the course of many months. Not dramatically. Not with speeches or gestures. Just consistently. Steadily. With the specific, unhurried quality that is simply how he moves through the world and, for reasons I no longer question, how he moves toward me. I have a plant on my windowsill. It has not died. I think about this more than is probably proportionate. I am, by most accounts, still a perfectly reasonable person. I pay my rent on time. I return library books before their due dates. I hold doors open for strangers and say thank you to baristas, but I also say the thing I'm actually thinking. I notice when someone is not listening and I name it, calmly, without apology. I have opinions about rice and I share them. I go to the roof and I stay as long as I want to stay, and 2 nights ago, Marvin stood in my kitchen in the particular light of a Thursday evening and said, unprompted, "I like who you are," and I believed him. Not because I had stopped being afraid. But because I had decided, somewhere along the way, that afraid was something you could be and still move forward. Still knock on a door. Still say, I'm willing to find out. I am, it turns out, willing to find out. I'm still finding out. That, as it turns out, is enough. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.